So as I said, we're starting with two presentations. Professor Angus Dawson from the Centre for Value Ethics and Law in Medicine at the University of Sydney, followed by Professor Winston Liao, who works in our local health district. I've just got to introduce Angus very quickly. I've got a longer curriculum vitae, and it's amazingly impressive in terms of the role, international role and reputation that Angus has. But for about less than a year, he's been the Professor of Bioethics and Director of VLM at the University of Sydney, a small unit, although getting bigger over the years. Well, it's actually not small at all now, it used to be small. And he's a director of that unit. And there are many links between this district and other districts and VLM in terms of research and evaluation, and ethical inquiry, and that's a great thing. It really is VLM's a wonderful resource for the New South Wales health system. Angus has published extensively on many issues in bioethics, particularly recently public health ethics, vaccinations and issues related to lifestyle choices and the use of empirical evidence in moral arguments. And Angus is going to start off our evening with some commentary on ethics of resource allocation in the context of scarcity. Thank you, Angus.
Thank you very much, Greg. It's great to be here. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak to you tonight. So what I'm going to try and do is just to take you through some language that we can use through the rest of the evening to talk about the particular case study and some of the background ethical issues. So a good starting point is to think about resource allocation and what kind of questions of resource allocation actually are. And I want to propose that it is something which ought not to be thought of as just being a technical question. We don't just ask the health economist or some other technical person that has an algorithm to press a button on a computer and provide the answer. When we think about resource allocation, we're thinking specifically about normative questions. And by that I mean questions about how we ought to behave, how we ought to think about the ways that we interact with each other. Okay, so our resource is really limited. I think this is a good place to start. So the picture of this very elaborate cake, this is my almost my only picture. I'm not big on pictures in presentations. The idea here is to say, well, we can answer this question by saying that the cake can always be bigger. So we can ask politicians, we can ask the public to provide more resources. But at the end of the day, however big the cake is, it has to be divided up. And we can think about this as involving three different levels. So macro, meso, and micro. I'll just say a little bit about each. So at the macro level, thinking about New South Wales government, the federal government, there are decisions to be made about how we prioritise health in relation to other considerations, including other considerations that have an impact upon health. So many non-health policies actually impact upon health. You know, systems to encourage people to travel more by car will have a cost in relation to more accidents, pedestrians, cyclists being knocked off their bikes, etc. So those kinds of decisions have health consequences. At the meso level, we can think about how within the overall health budget we allocate things to different areas of activity. And a classic example, as you heard, one of my interests is in public health, and we might ask a question about what is the appropriate percentage of a health budget to be spent upon prevention rather than treatment. So that is something that is a policy issue and is something which is, once we've decided how big the health cake is, we can then think about, well, what proportion, what size of slice are we going to allocate to these different kinds of activities. And many of these decisions involve substantive, normative, ethical questions about what our priorities ought to be. So are we thinking about the length of life, the quality of life of people? How do we think about issues relating to the amount of resources that we prioritize for treating people? How much do we think about other kinds of potential costs, such as funding infertility treatment? And at the micro level, which I think is the main issue that concerns us today, at this level, the role of the individual healthcare professional, the healthcare worker, that's what HCW stands for, or a team working together, questions arise about how decisions ought to be made about the allocation. And here's a list of some of the kinds of considerations that people often suggest are important when making these decisions. So these are going to be controversial. Some are going to be issues which perhaps many people are just going to want to hold are irrelevant. But that in itself, once you start suggesting, debating what are the important considerations and which can be set aside, you're, without knowing it, involved in that ethical normative discussion. What are the appropriate criteria for making decisions about resource allocation at the individual clinical level? So we can focus on issues to do with the likely effectiveness of treatment. So given the evidence that we have, given past experience, how effective is this likely to be? Ideas about age, social usefulness. So is this person a really important person? You know, are they a serious senior politician, somebody who's vital to the life of the nation? Or are they, you know, merely some aging teacher who just teaches primary school students anyway, so not particularly important? Think about moral worth, so the kind of judgments that we might make, and then focusing that on self-infliction of illness. So is somebody a smoker? You know, are they overweight? Have they failed to take advice in the past for how they ought to behave as a responsible citizen, and therefore they're liable for the consequences of their behavior? We might think about need, quality of life, so producing the best quality of life for people, and then first in the queue. So maybe if we have limited resources, what we ought to do is sort of take the first person that turns up with a particular condition and we treat them until we run out of funds. And lastly, one very important factor which many clinicians will always focus on, the idea of a particular individual being your patient, and that being a reason to actually prioritize them when it comes to thinking about resources. So keep those in mind. I'm not going to suggest what the answer is in my view. These are considerations that I think will come back when we start looking at the case. So the second thing that I want to do is to talk a little bit at a sort of slightly theoretical level about how we might think about decisions to do with allocation being carried out. And of course there are many possible ways of seeking to do this, and I'm going to only quickly mention 4. So there's ideas to do with intuition, fair process, a sort of technical approach to this, and then thinking about substantive accounts of justice. So the first one, an intuitive approach. The idea here is that you are seeking to do what's best for the individual patient. So there's an appeal to what your immediate reaction might be, your feelings about what's appropriate. And there are all kinds of reasons why this might be advantageous. Often these feelings of what we ought to do are extremely powerful, and they might be shared between individuals. They might be shared across a team who work in a particular area of healthcare. Perhaps particular kind of people are attracted to a particular kind of work, so intuitions might be shared. And one of the advantages of making decisions in this way is that you don't need to worry about all the big words that I'm going to mention in a minute. You don't need to worry about the bureaucracy in terms of thinking about, well, last week we did this in relation to that patient. Do you remember? What's different about this case? You just react because your intuition tells you that's the right thing to do. And of course, the contrary side of that is that there's all kinds of objections that there might be because you might well be being inconsistent. So as far as you can tell, the patient today is just like that patient last week in all relevant respects, but you've made exactly the opposite judgment. What is it that's brought about that different outcome? And once we start thinking about different outcomes for no good reason, then we might start using moral language again and start thinking about, is this actually fair? Is it fair that the person who has exactly the same condition who had a different outcome last week, we treat in a different way? The second way of approaching this is an account which focuses on fair process. So this idea really comes from a thought about giving up on the philosophical debate about what justice is. So we don't know what justice is, it's too difficult, there's too much disagreement. So what we need instead is we have an agreed process. We have what's called a fair process. And the most famous account of this derives from the work of Norman Daniels, some of his colleagues, and is called Accountability for Reasonableness, or A for R. And the idea is roughly that you have a system in place that allocates things in an objective way by providing reasons why particular decisions are made. So there's a stepping back from the intuitive, stepping back from the individual response to a particular case, and there's a focus on trying to think about, well, what are good reasons for the decisions that we might make for allocation? And we provide those reasons to the public, and they can therefore be subject to discussion and dispute and perhaps revision as a result of that public discussion. The third approach would be to call in the health economists, and there are many different mechanisms you could use to try and make allocation decisions using technical ways of doing evaluation of the benefits that might come from interventions, thinking about what the costs actually are. But of course, any kind of technical procedure like that is potentially going to be contentious, and there are a whole set of assumptions in the background about what kinds of things are valuable. Should we prioritize the quality of somebody's life over the length of life? And many of the mechanisms, such as QALYs, quality adjusted life years, the idea there is that there's a metric to try and evaluate different kinds of possible interventions for conditions by trying to trade off the impact in terms of the effectiveness against the actual length of life that comes. So that looks great as a sort of technical fix to the problem, but there are a whole set of assumptions in the background which can be perhaps disputed. And then the last account, no surprise that this would be my own preference, given my background in philosophy. So philosophers have argued for at least 2,500 years about what justice actually consists in, and we've pretty much reached a conclusion, which is, after all that time, which is amazing in itself. So the conclusion is that we should all be egalitarians, so we should all believe in equality. The problem is that we can't agree what that actually means in terms of what kinds of things ought to be equally distributed. So we can focus on thinking about health, but we can't really take somebody from some health from somebody that's super healthy and give it to somebody that's unhealthy. So we have to look for other kinds of proxies. And the most popular ones are to focus on ideas about equality of opportunity and equality of welfare or outcomes. And the thought there is that we might think about the difference between equality and equity. So equality might suggest that we give equal amounts of a particular good, a particular resource to everybody. Equity is going to suggest that we give unequal amounts to people because of inequalities that exist prior to the distribution. So if you are unhealthy, you have some health needs, then perhaps you need greater support, and therefore the appropriate ethical healthcare system ought to give you more resources to try and compensate you for the situation with which you start. And then secondly, this is where the long words come in, we have three different ways of thinking about this distribution. So strict egalitarians are going to argue that equality is something perhaps that is intrinsically valuable. It's valuable in itself that we end up with equal kinds of situations. And there are various kind of objections to that view. Okay, thanks. Secondly, we have prioritarians who want to argue that what's most important is that we focus our resources upon those that are disadvantaged in various ways. So those that are perhaps most in need ought to be the ones that require the greatest resources. And then sufficientarianism is an idea about we have what we might think of as being a minimal, adequate level of welfare, and what we need to do is ensure that everybody at least gets to that. And then after that level has been reached, it's really up to individuals themselves perhaps to act in ways to promote their own health. So I just wanted to end by going back to one of the possible issues to do with how we might allocate resources, something that is, I think, intuitively attractive to many people, and many people, particularly people like me that are now getting on in years, might find repellent. So should we actually think about the place of age as being a relevant consideration when thinking about the allocation of resources? So given a choice between allocating resources to neonatal intensive care or to care for the elderly, many people, if you ask the general public, would actually prioritize the pediatric care. And Norman Daniels, who I mentioned before, has a whole kind of account about whether this is legitimate, and he argues that it is. And he suggests that it's legitimate to focus on age because we all have a lifespan. And as long as we're all treated in the same kind of way across our lifespan, then we've met the considerations of justice. So remember, he was an advocate for the idea of a process to be put in place that provides reasons why we make the allocation decisions that we do. So he has this idea about using the analogy of saving, and he argues that most reasonable people would want to ensure that they have a reasonably long life. And for that reason, we ought to prioritize sort of resources put in at the beginning of life rather than the end of life. So how might this work in relation to each of the four models that I provided? I think it has got intuitive appeal to many. Daniels himself would argue that he has a fair process for doing this. So this would be proposed in a public document, and there could be consultation and discussion about it. Cost effectiveness, well, certainly sort of mechanisms such as QALYs do have a capacity to basically have a multiplier for the length of life that might come. So QALYs seem to have built in this idea about length of life being something that's important. And the substantive accounts of justice, it really depends which of those accounts you want to focus on. But arguably, if we're talking about the distribution of resources across every single individual life, then that's possibly going to meet the criteria for each of those three possible substantive accounts of justice, which I just mentioned. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angus. Lovely introduction to what Winston's now about to talk about, which it brings the discussions today down to a kind of organisation and clinical level. The title of the talk, Organisational and Clinical Considerations in Approving Expensive Drugs for Exceptional Use. Winston Lau is an oncologist and a clinical pharmacologist, practices in both those fields at St George, both St George Public and St George Private Hospital. 2 or 3 years ago, was appointed as the Director of the Cancer Clinical Stream across the South Eastern Sydney Local Health District, and in that role has the responsibilities for coordination of services, improvement in quality, and various other aspects that senior clinicians in clinical stream roles have. And I note, on looking at Winston's longer CV, that he's got a postgraduate degree in public policy, so I'm sure he's applying that all the time in consideration of issues that we're about to talk about. Thanks, Winston.
Thanks, Greg. So I guess I'm going to be talking a bit about the fair allocation and technical process side of things, and I'll be talking from a New South Wales health perspective. It's been mentioned that I'm the Director of the Cancer Services Stream for South East. I have another role in terms of declaring potential conflicts or dualities of interest. So I'm on the Board of Directors of NPS Medicine Wise, and NPS is in a way the custodian of Australia's national medicine policy. We have a role to play in ensuring through the national medicines policy that there is equitable access to medications and other medical technologies. It also is involved with sponsoring the Council of Australian Therapeutics Assessment Groups, and some of the slides that I will show, the diagrams, are drawn from the guidelines that the KTAG has produced in relationship to guiding hospital drug committees as to how they should conduct their operations. So, I'm going to talk about processes related to individual patient use applications, and these are applications for a particular patient to receive a particular treatment. I'm going to discuss some of the issues of concern in reaching a decision, although they've been touched on already. And I'm really going to focus around the processes. I want to touch on a couple of terms, including off-label use of medications, and particularly in the context of emerging evidence and high-cost medications. So, by way of background, hospitals have maintained what we call medication formularies. These are essentially lists of all the medications in a hospital that a medical practitioner may prescribe. A formulary is not necessarily a list of what's actually available in the hospital. So some hospitals will choose not to stock certain drugs if, for example, they don't have any HIV patients, they won't stock HIV-related medications. The medications must be approved by the hospital drug committee to be on formulary, and in our committee processes, generally we will approve pretty much anything that is been through the federal approval processes. So they're on the Australian Register of Therapeutics Goods, which is approved through a subcommittee of the TGA, and then they're funded through the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. With a slight caveat that some of the states have agreements with the Commonwealth around availability of PBS-listed medications in hospitals, whereas New South Wales does not have such an arrangement at the current time. When a formulary approval is given, there may be restrictions placed on a particular medication. So we might say, for example, that only cancer drugs can be prescribed by an oncologist. Alternatively, we might say that a drug can only be used in a particular population of patients. We do have these processes for once-off uses. These are called individual patient use applications, and an individual patient use might be, for example, a drug that's listed on the PBS, but for one type of condition, but the particular physician wishes to use it for an alternate condition for which it's not funded by the PBS, but it's a high-cost drug, so we may wish to use it in that circumstance. Occasionally, and this is not very common, but occasionally a drug is neither listed by the PBS or on the ARTG. And in this circumstance, for example, you might import a drug from overseas under the auspice of a special access scheme. And this is something that not many people are actually aware of. You can pretty much order whatever you like from overseas and bring it in, providing you send the appropriate declarations into the TGA. A lot of medications we use are used in what's called an off-label setting, and I'll explain that in a bit more detail later. An example of this is many of the medications, if not most, that are older medications have never been tested in children but are commonly used in children. But the label, the listing from the Therapeutics Goods Administration applies to adults. So treatment of an infection in adults, for example, might be standard practice to use the drug in children, but technically it's off the label as listed in the government guidelines. Occasionally there are experimental indications, and it is possible to, through the SAS scheme, to administer medications in a quasi-experimental context and not necessarily be a clinical trial per se. And finally, we have orphan drugs, which have quite varying availability through the healthcare system. So an orphan drug in Australia is a medication that is thought to, if it's going to be used, only used in rare diseases, and that disease would have less than 2,000 people who might qualify for use of that drug in Australia. So what happens in an IPU process? So an application is made to the hospital or facility or district drug committee, and the drug committees typically meet on a monthly basis. We have processes for out-of-session approvals. Often these requests are made on an urgent basis, and in the case of our district drug committee, the way that's handled is the Secretariat of the Drug Committee will send out the application to several of the members, including myself and Jim Mack and George Rubin. We'll review it, make any comments. If we think it's appropriate, we'll make an approval and bring it back to the full committee for facilitation. There is a process for thinking about these approvals, and this is the algorithm used by the committee and recommended by New South Wales Therapeutics Assessment Group. You can find this on the web if you just Google New South Wales TAG. First of all, we are looking at what's the role of this medication potentially for this particular individual and their condition. And we will look at whether there's a safety advantage, whether there's an efficacy advantage, and what the level of evidence is. Is it high-level evidence from, say, a phase 3 randomised trial, or is it anecdotal evidence from case reports? If there does seem to be an advantage, then the algorithm tends to focus on cost. At the moment, at the local facility level, if intervention costs less than $10,000, the facility will deal with it. Over $10,000, it comes up to the district committee. Part of the cost issue is that there needs to be approval from the various heads of departments, and the divisional heads, and basically you need to be able to say that you're willing to support this from your particular cost bucket. So we do consider that in a quasi-pharmacoeconomic way, in the sense of can we afford it, but it's not in a relative way of what is the comparative effectiveness, except if we want to use this in a circumstance as a replacement for an existing therapy. If we ultimately approve it, it goes on to, it gets approved with conditions which include reporting. We want to hear back from the prescribers as to whether or not the treatments worked, what the outcome for the individual was. If we see 3 or more individual patient uses come to us, we ask the applicants, you seem to be using this fairly frequently, do you want to actually make a full formulary application? We think about these issues in terms of, is there justification for exceptional use? So is there really a serious underlying disease? Is it life-threatening? Is this the only option for a patient? Is there any evidence at all to support a beneficial effect? Do those benefits outweigh the risks and potential harms? Have the patient exhausted standard alternatives that are readily available? And is consent already obtained or going to be obtained? And it's clearly the case that we insist that the patients undertake an informed consent process so that they understand that this is an unusual activity and a non-standard use. Off-label use of medicines I've mentioned, and it's not uncommon that individual patient use applications are also off-label uses. So, for example, we have cancer drug called Avastin or bevacizumab. It's used to treat some cancers as standard practice, and is approved in Australia and funded in Australia for very particular subsets of patients. So patients with metastatic bowel cancer is an example. If I chose to try this for a brain tumour, that would be an off-label use. There is a bit of evidence to support it, but we would need to apply to the committee to use that agent for that purpose. Again, particularly important, we've actually got a separate form for this in our district for off-label use of medicines, so informed consent is required for use of those agents. A particular activity that affects us is expanded access programs. So expanded access programs are programs provided by pharmaceutical companies to enable access to new medications. And usually this is prior to PBS listing, but often already after listing on the ARTG. Listing on the ARTG gives the pharmaceutical company the right to be able to market their product. So they can either provide it to patients or they can sell it to patients. And this is in an off-trial setting, so it's usually not as a clinical trial, although sometimes it can be construed as a clinical trial, and it can be a bit not terribly transparent sometimes. And in actual fact, I have seen trials which were actually marketing programs, and have, when I was previously chairing a research ethics committee, we rejected a trial because in the translation from the French, the company had failed to delete the paragraph saying this is purely a marketing exercise to establish entry into the Australian market. So they couldn't really argue with us at that point. In some cases, drug on these access programs is provided for free, with the return to the company being that they want to hear whether or not there are any side effects and so forth. But in other access programs, drug is provided on a cost-sharing basis, and this is going to become an increasing issue for drug committees and been a major issue in recent years. So cost-sharing is where the company will provide some drug for free, but the purchaser, whether it be a hospital facility or a patient directly, will pay for some of that drug. So an example of this is if your patient wishes to have this treatment and they pay $20,000 for 2 months of treatment, and that number is not an exaggeration, and it works, we'll give them the rest of their treatment for free. So that's a common approach. Sometimes it might be we'll pay for every first or second cycle and so forth and alternate. So it can be very expensive, and a particular issue for our drug committee is that we will approve these programs providing there's no expectation that if the company stops providing the drug for free, that the district will be able to pay for it. Out for commentary at the moment is New South Wales TAG guidelines for recommendations around what we should think about if there is a situation arise where patients are required or requested to pay for access to drugs. I won't go through this in detail, but essentially to take a quality use of medicines approach, to think about benefits and harms, to think about informed consent, and what happens if the medication is discontinued. Not a great deal of commentary, although this is the summary recommendations around equity of access. Some of the resource allocation conundrums, and this is my last slide. So ostensibly the drug committee is managing the hospital drug budget, but in actual fact we don't have much visibility around that budget, and we don't really say we've allocated this much for the kidney department and that much for the cancer department, and that's how it lies. Applications are not contemporaneous, so we operate on financial years. If the applications all flood in August, there might not, it's theoretically possible that there's nothing to hand out in May, and that certainly is an issue for how we're running the hospitals and facilities at a macro level. Each application is undertaken on its merits, but it's not really compared to the other applications. The clinical scenarios that present themselves are often quite different, and it's often difficult to compare these things. It's very difficult for us to take into consideration issues of equity, and particularly when this self-paying issue pops its head up. I've been talking about the public health system, but in the private healthcare system, a practitioner like myself might just say, oh, look, I know this expanded access program, I'll just fill out this form, get the drug from the pharmacy, providing you hand over your Visa or MasterCard. And certainly that happens outside any formal regulatory process. It's also very difficult to sometimes make value assessments in the context of limited information. So we take on good faith what we're told about patients when we take these applications in. We don't really know what clinical situation they're in without seeing them, and sometimes we've had to ask them, can you really give us a bit more information about what this person's medical condition is like? But also sometimes it's difficult to make these judgments in the situation of limited evidence about a treatment, particularly in poor prognosis patients with incurable diseases who you could argue are purchasing hope by trying to obtain these new medications. The other thing we do is we're a pharmaceutical committee. We have some expertise on the committee about these medications. There's physicians and administrators and so forth. We are reliant on the expertise and the people making the applications. So whilst I'm a medical oncologist and know a little bit about blood cancers, we receive applications from haematologists about fancy new medications used in fourth-line treatment of relapsed lymphoma, and we're reliant on the expert advice of the very people who are making the applications and the department heads who are approving them. And we also may not be privy to what other non-pharmaceutical alternatives there might be. If there's an operation or a device or something that might be an alternative, often we don't have access to that information. And actually, some of the other high-cost things that aren't pharmaceuticals that come to district or facility committees, often they don't have a place to sit properly. So we can't really decide, do we invest in this medication instead of that operation? That's very difficult to do in our circumstance. And there are some products that actually fall into the gaps. So for example, at St George, we do a treatment called lutetium, which is radionuclide therapy for a rare type of tumour called neuroendocrine tumours. That treatment, nobody wants to regulate because they can't decide if it's a pharmaceutical or a radiopharmaceutical or a device. And it's quite expensive, at between $12,000 and $20,000 for a course of treatment for a patient, but actually the alternative medications cost about $5,000 to $6,000 a month and don't have a once-off utilisation. So we haven't had a mechanism to try and compare those things, particularly in the context of limited randomised evidence. So that's where I'm going to stop, and I'll hand over so that we can have our panel discussion.